The attaché saw it first. Not the contact itself. That had been a pale smear on the sensor wall for the better part of an hour, blooming and contracting like something breathing at the edge of detection. What liaison third-rank Asivan saw was the captain's face when the tactical officer read the count aloud. 47 confirmed signatures, Captain. Veth Dominion Battle Echelon. They've dropped to sublight in a picket spread across the Karatha corridor. Captain Maren Stahl did not react. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her boots planted on the worn deck plating of the Resolute's command bridge, and she looked at the projection like a woman reading weather. Asivan had served as a diplomatic observer aboard alien vessels before, Talani cruisers, hegemony patrol ships, even a collective scout, and he had learned to read the moment a commander's posture betrayed what their voice would not. With the Talani it was the ears, folding flat. With the hegemony it was the mandibles, clicking without sound. With humans it was supposed to be the eyes. Stahl's eyes said nothing. They were the color of tarnished steel, set deep in a face that carried too many years for the rank, and they moved across the sensor wall with the slow precision of someone counting rounds in a magazine. 47, she said. Yes, ma'am. Lead element is a Veth Sovereign class, their flagship, probably the Akathan's verdict. The rest are a mix. 12 heavy cruisers, 18 destroyers, 9 escort frigates, and 7 supply tenders spread in a trailing screen. Stahl's executive officer, Commander Halloran, stepped up beside her. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of disciplined quiet that Asivan had learned meant danger in human military culture. The louder ones were manageable. The quiet ones had already decided something. They're blocking the corridor, Halloran said. Spread wide enough to detect anything that tries to slip past on the margins. That's not a patrol formation. That's a net. It's a net, Stahl agreed. Question is whether we're the fish they cast it for, or whether we just swam into someone else's trap. Asivan felt his throat tighten. He was standing at the observer's station, a small console bolted to the port bulkhead, deliberately positioned where he could see but not touch. The Resolute had carried him for 11 standard days now, ferrying him from the failed negotiations at Pelavar Station back to the nearest neutral port, and in that time he had come to understand 2 things about the ship. First, it was old. Not elderly the way Veth ships were old, maintained and ceremonial and polished until every surface reflected rank. The Resolute was old the way scar tissue was old. Every surface carried the memory of something that had tried to kill it. The deck plating was mismatched in places. Replacement panels from 3 different shipyards welded beside original hull sections that still bore the scorched shadows of weapons fire from a war that had ended before Asivan was born. The bridge smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and the faint, metallic tang of overworked power conduits. Above the weapons officer's console, a small section of bulkhead still carried the rippled distortion of a plasma strike that had penetrated the outer hull 14 years ago and turned the air inside the bridge into something unsurvivable for 3 seconds. They had replaced the bridge crew but not the bulkhead. Asivan had asked about it once. Halloran had said, "That's the reminder," and left it at that. The corridors were worse. Asivan had walked the length of the ship on his 3rd day aboard. The Cultural Liaison Handbook encouraged familiarization with the host vessel, and what he'd found was a warship that wore its history the way geology wore strata. Each deck told a different era story. The main gun housing still carried the factory stamps of the Calder shipworks, where the Resolute had been laid down 41 years ago. The port-side maneuvering thrusters bore the welds of the Brecon refit, 18 years later. The medical bay had been rebuilt entirely after something the crew referred to only as the Tesserin action, and it smelled of antiseptic and new composite in a way that clashed with the aged, oil-soaked air of the rest of the ship. Every patch, every replaced panel, every mismatch in hull plating told the same story. Something had tried to break this ship, and human hands had put it back together, and then something else had tried to break it again, and human hands had come back and put it together once more. 41 years of that cycle, and the ship was still here. Second, it was enormous. Not by the numbers, the Resolute was classified as a Terran Vanguard-class dreadnought, and its tonnage fell within parameters that the Veth Dominion would have labeled merely heavy cruiser by their own standards. But the mass of the thing was distributed wrong. It sat in space like a clenched fist, dense and compact and radiating a thermal signature that the ship's own crew joked about. "We run hot," Halloran had said when Estevan asked about the heat veins cycling along the dorsal spine. "Always have. Old reactors, old blood." The engine core alone put out enough thermal bleed to register on passive scanners at distances that should have been impossible for a ship this size. The Veth built their warships to run cold, to move through space like whispers, detectable only when they chose to be. The Resolute ran like a furnace with the door open, and it didn't care who noticed. Now those reactors were humming a full octave lower than their standard cruise note, and Estevan could feel the vibration through the soles of his feet. The ship was thinking. "Helm reduced to 1/4, Stahl said. "Passive sensors only. I want everything we can pull on that formation without pinging them." "Aye, Captain, 1/4 passive only." The bridge crew moved with the kind of rehearsed economy that Estevan found unsettling. No one asked why. No one looked at anyone else for confirmation. Orders flowed from Stahl to stations and were executed in the time it took to breathe, and the silence that settled afterward was not the silence of fear, but the silence of a machine cycling into a new gear. Halloran leaned close to Stahl. Estevan's hearing was sharper than humans assumed, a fact he had never corrected. 47 ships, Captain, we're one. I'm aware of the arithmetic, Commander. If that's the Akathan's verdict at the center, they've got enough firepower to glass a continent. The Veth don't run sovereign-class flagships for patrol duty. That's a strike group. Which means they're here for a reason, and that reason might not be us. With respect, ma'am, we just left a negotiation that collapsed specifically because the Veth delegation walked out. If they've moved a strike group into the corridor between Pelavar and neutral space, the timing isn't coincidence. Stahl turned her head just enough to look at Halloran. "I know what it looks like, Marcus. I also know what happens if I assume the worst and open fire on 47 ships that might be here for something else entirely. Last time a Terran captain did that, the Garen incident, 18 years ago, we spent 6 years and 400 diplomats putting the pieces back together. I served on one of those diplomatic escort missions. I watched what it cost. 2 species that should have been allies spent half a decade negotiating reparations for a fight that started because a captain trusted his gut over his sensors. And if they're not here for something else, then we'll know soon enough." The Resolute drifted forward at quarter speed, and the sensor wall bloomed with data. Estevan watched the Veth formation resolve from smears into icons, each one tagged with estimated mass, energy output, and weapons status. The Sovereign-class flagship sat at the center of the formation like a stone in a river, and the cruisers and destroyers fanned out from it in a pattern that Estevan recognized from his own military training. A Veth denial screen, designed to funnel anything approaching into a kill corridor between the heaviest guns. It was a textbook formation. He had written an analysis of it once, during his second posting, in a paper that earned him a commendation and a promotion. Seeing it deployed against the ship he was standing on felt considerably different from writing about it in a warm office on a station that had never been fired upon. "They've seen us," the sensor officer said. "Lead elements are adjusting. 2 destroyers breaking from the western edge. They're angling to bracket our approach vector. Time to intercept. At current speeds, 42 minutes. If they go to full power, 18. Stahl looked at the projection for a long time. The 2 destroyer icons were creeping toward the edges of the display like pincers closing. "Helm, come about to heading 174. Take us along the Karatha Shoals. Keep the asteroid belt between us and their main body. 174I, threading the shoals. Halloran's jaw tightened. We're running. We're repositioning, Commander. There's a difference. The crew won't see one. The crew will follow orders. Stahl's voice carried no heat. It was the flattest, most featureless thing Osivan had ever heard from a human, and it frightened him more than shouting would have. I am not going to fire the first shot at a Veth battle echelon in neutral space on the assumption that they're here for us. If I'm wrong, we've started a war. If I'm right, we'll have proof before we need guns. The Resolute turned. It was a slow, ponderous rotation. The ship's mass fought every course change like something reluctant, and as it swung onto its new heading, the asteroid belt that lined the Karatha corridor slid into view on the forward display. Dense, cluttered, studded with rocks the size of small moons. Bad space for a warship. Worse space for a fleet. Perfect space for one ship that didn't want to be found. Osivan understood then what the captain was doing. She was pulling the Resolute into terrain where numbers meant nothing, where 47 ships would have to come at her in ones and twos through gaps in the rock, where their formation would scatter and their coordination would break. She was not running. She was choosing the ground. The two Veth destroyers adjusted course to follow. They're matching our heading change, the sensor officer confirmed. Both destroyers accelerating. The main body hasn't moved yet. Yet, Halloran said quietly. Stahl said nothing. She watched the display and the display watched her back. The first hour inside the Karatha Shoals was a slow, grinding negotiation between the Resolute and the rock. The asteroid belt was a labyrinth, tumbling nickel-iron masses laced with mineral dust and magnetic anomalies that scrambled sensors and choked communications. The Resolute navigated it the way a surgeon navigates scar tissue, carefully, by feel, with occasional bursts of speed through clear patches that lasted seconds before the walls closed in again. The navigation officer, Lieutenant Voss, worked the charts in continuous, quiet communication with the helm. She had a steady voice and a way of calling distances that turned raw numbers into something tactile. 300 meters clearance, port side, narrowing, 260, 240, steady. Opening now 400 meters were clear for the next 800. Every gap was a calculation. Every calculation was a bet that the Resolute's beam width, its turning radius, and the drift of the rock around it would all align for the 3 to 8 seconds needed to slip through. Voss never raised her voice. She never hesitated. She just kept calling numbers, and the helmsman kept threading the needle, and the asteroid walls tumbled past on either side close enough that Osivan could see individual craters and mineral veins in the rock through the bridge's secondary display. The two Veth destroyers followed. They were faster, lighter, more maneuverable, and they closed the distance with the patient certainty of predators who knew the terrain favored the pursuit. But they couldn't bracket the Resolute. Every time they tried to split and flank, Stahl adjusted course, threading the dreadnought through gaps that should have been too narrow for a ship its size, keeping rock between the Resolute and at least one of its pursuers at all times. Range to nearest destroyer, 2,400 meters, the sensor officer called. She's trying to get a targeting lock through the interference. Let her try, Stahl said. The magnetic hash in this section will scatter anything she fires before it crosses the gap. She'd need to close to under 1,000 meters for a clean shot, and at that range she'd have to be in front of us. She's not stupid enough to cross our bow. Then she's not stupid enough to fire. Let her tail us. She's telling her flagship everything she sees, and what she sees is a Terran dreadnought that hasn't charged its weapons. That's the message I want delivered. The Veth destroyer held at 2,000 meters, shadowing the Resolute through the rock, waiting for an opening that Stahl never gave her. At the 90-minute mark, the sensor officer's voice changed. Contact. 4 more signatures entering the shoals from the east. Veth cruisers, heavy class. That's the net tightening, Halloran said. They're feeding ships in behind us. I see them. Stahl's voice hadn't changed in 90 minutes, the same flat, measuring tone. Osivan had begun to wonder if it was natural or trained, whether somewhere in the Terran military there was a course on how to sound like you had already accounted for the worst. Helm, bring us to heading 209. There's a dense cluster at bearing 335. The magnetic field should mask our signature for 20 minutes if we sit still. 209I. The Resolute slipped behind a tumbling mass of iron-rich asteroid, and the sensor wall dissolved into static. For the first time in hours, they were blind, but so was anything trying to find them. In the sudden quiet, Stahl turned to Osivan. Liaison Osivan, you observed the Pelavar negotiations. In your professional assessment, does the Veth Dominion want a war, or does it want a provocation? The question caught him off guard. Diplomats were not supposed to be consulted on tactical matters, but Stahl was watching him with those tarnished steel eyes, and he understood that she was not asking for diplomatic analysis. She was asking whether the people chasing her wanted her dead or wanted her to shoot first. A provocation, he said. The Veth delegation at Pelavar didn't walk out because the negotiations failed. They walked out because the negotiations were succeeding. Their military faction, the Akathan bloc, needs a casus belli. A Terran warship firing on Veth vessels in neutral space would give them exactly what they need. Stahl nodded once. That's what I thought. Captain, Halloran said, if that's true, then they'll keep pushing until we either fire or they can manufacture something close enough. Every hour we spend in these rocks, they feed more ships in. Sooner or later we run out of places to hide. I'm not hiding, Commander, I'm thinking. Stahl turned back to the display. The static was beginning to clear as the asteroid rotated away. Get me a full plot of the shoals, every gap, every dense cluster, every magnetic anomaly. And get me the comm officer. I want to know if we can punch a signal through the interference to Terran command. Negative on the signal, Captain, the comm officer said immediately. The magnetic hash is too dense. We'd need to clear the shoals entirely or find a gap in the field, and the nearest gap is 4 hours ahead. 4 hours. Stahl's fingers tapped once against the display edge. Fine, we do this alone. The next 2 hours were the strangest Osivan had ever spent aboard a warship. Stahl pored over the asteroid chart with her navigation officer, Lieutenant Voss, tracing routes through the rock with her finger, measuring gaps against the Resolute's beam width, noting magnetic fields and sensor shadows. She wasn't planning a battle. She was planning a conversation, one conducted in maneuvers instead of words, where every course change was a sentence and every position was an argument. 3 times during the plotting, the sensor officer reported new Veth contacts entering the shoals. The count rose from 6 to 9 to 14. Each time, Stahl marked the new contact on her chart, adjusted a route, and kept working. The weapons officer, a compact woman named Driscoll whose console sat directly beneath the warped bulkhead of the old plasma strike, watched these reports with a kind of coiled readiness that Osivan found deeply uncomfortable. She had not spoken a word in 3 hours. Her hands rested on her console the way a pianist's hands rest on keys before the first chord, and every time the sensor count ticked upward, her fingers shifted, not to her controls, but closer to them. A centimeter at a time, like a tide rising. At the second hour, Halloran brought Stahl coffee black, in a battered metal cup that had more dents than the ship's hull, which was saying something. She took it without looking away from the chart and drank it in 3 swallows, and it was the most human thing Osivan had seen her do since the count was first read aloud. For 90 seconds, she was not a captain calculating routes through an asteroid field with 47 warships closing behind her. She was a tired woman drinking bitter coffee on a ship that smelled of machine oil, because it was the only comfort available and she had the sense to take it when it was offered. Then the cup was empty, and the captain was back, and her finger traced another route through the rock. At 3:40 ship time, The Resolute broke from cover and accelerated hard through a gap in the rock, emerging into a relatively clear stretch of the shoals, a pocket of open space roughly 40 kilometers across, hemmed in on all sides by dense asteroid clusters. Stahl positioned the ship at the center and stopped. "All stop, power down, weapons to standby, raise shields to defensive only." The bridge went very quiet. Driscoll's hands froze on her console, mid-drift toward the firing controls, as if she had been caught reaching for something she wasn't supposed to touch. "Ma'am," Halloran's voice was careful. "Defensive posture, Commander. I want them to see that we're not charging our guns." "With respect, Captain, they have 14 ships in the shoals now, more on the way. If they come through those gaps, they'll come through one at a time. The gaps are too narrow for anything larger than a destroyer to transit abreast, and they'll see a Terran dreadnought sitting in the middle of a clearing with its weapons cold." Stahl paused. "What they do with that information tells us everything." The Veth came through 11 minutes later. The first destroyer nosed through the eastern gap, its weapons hot, its shields at full combat power. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and held position, scanning the Resolute with active sensors that painted the dreadnought's hull in sweeps of electromagnetic energy. A second destroyer came through the southern gap, then a cruiser through the west, then 2 more destroyers from the north. Within 20 minutes, 5 Veth warships ringed the clearing, their weapons trained on the Resolute from 5 different angles. The Resolute sat with its weapons powered down, its shields on standby, and its running lights steady. "They're hailing us," the comm officer said. "Put it through." The voice that came through the bridge speakers was Veth, deep, layered with the harmonic undertones that marked their species, a sound that carried authority the way a bass note carried weight. Asivan translated automatically in his head, but the ship systems provided a flat English rendering. "Terran vessel Resolute, you are in violation of Veth sovereign space. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded for inspection." Stahl's expression didn't change. "This is the Karatha corridor. It's designated neutral under the Pelavar Accords. The Pelavar Accords are suspended pending review. This space is under Veth Dominion military authority effective immediately. Comply or be fired upon." Stahl looked at Halloran. Halloran looked back. Something passed between them, not words, not a signal, just the kind of understanding that came from years of serving on the same bridge, surviving the same scars. "Commander," Stahl said quietly, "are the main guns spun up?" "They can be in 9 seconds. Keep them cold." She keyed the comm. "Veth Commander, I am Captain Marin Stahl of the Terran Vanguard-class dreadnought Resolute. I am carrying a diplomatic observer who witnessed the Pelavar negotiations. I am not in violation of any standing accord. I will not power down my engines, and I will not submit to boarding." Silence. The 5 Veth ships held position, their weapons steady. "However," Stahl continued, "I am prepared to transmit my full navigational log and crew manifest to verify our identity and our route. If the Dominion has concerns about Terran military presence in the corridor, I will relay them to Terran Command upon my arrival at neutral port. That is the extent of my cooperation." More silence. Then the Veth voice, colder now, "Unacceptable. You will comply with boarding or face consequences." Stahl cut the comm. She stood for a moment, looking at the 5 ships arrayed around her, and Asivan saw something move behind those flat eyes, not fear, not anger, but something heavier. Something that had been there before this day, and would be there after it. "They want me to shoot," she said, to no one in particular. 5 ships, 5 angles. If I fire, it doesn't matter who I hit first, the other 4 fire back, and they have their provocation. The Akathan bloc gets their war, and every moderate in the Dominion who voted for the Pelavar talks gets buried." "And if you don't fire?" Asivan asked. He hadn't meant to speak, but the question was out before he could stop it. Stahl looked at him. Then they have to make the first move, and that changes the entire calculus. The standoff lasted 41 minutes. Asavan counted every one of them, each minute a small, precise unit of time in which everything could change and nothing did. The Resolute sat in the clearing, weapons cold, shields humming on standby, and the 5 Veth ships held their positions like fingers around a throat that refused to flinch. At minute 14, the tactical officer reported a power spike in the lead destroyer's weapons array charging to fire. Stahl didn't move. 6 seconds later, the spike subsided. The destroyer had blinked. At minute 22, the cruiser repositioned, edging closer, tightening the ring. Stahl noted it, said nothing. At minute 31, a second destroyer rotated to bring its broadside to bear. Its captain was nervous. The ship's maneuvering jets fired in short, ragged bursts, overcorrecting, the mark of a commander who wanted to look aggressive but wasn't sure he wanted to be. At minute 38, the sensor officer spoke. "Captain, the main Veth formation is moving. All 47 ships are entering the shoals." Halloran swore under his breath, a single, sharp word that Asavan filed away as a cultural artifact. "Heading. Converging on our position. ETA to the clearing, approximately 90 minutes, accounting for navigation through the rock." 47 ships, Stahl said, in an asteroid field. They're going to lose formation integrity, scatter their fire coordination, and risk collisions in the dense clusters. That's not a tactical decision. That's a political one. Someone aboard that flagship is overriding their combat commanders, because they want this resolved before anyone back home changes their mind. Or because they know we can't fight 47 ships regardless of terrain, Halloran said. Maybe. Stahl was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened and something in her posture shifted, subtle, but Asavan caught it. The weight behind her eyes didn't leave. It just moved aside to make room for something colder and more precise. All hands battle stations. Weapons to ready status, shields to full. The bridge transformed. Lights shifted from standard white to the red-amber of combat illumination. The weapons officer's hands moved across his console in precise, rapid sequences, and the Resolute's main guns, 8 spinal mount railguns that ran the full length of the ship's keel, began their slow, grinding spin-up cycle. The sound was a low, subsonic moan that Asavan felt in his teeth and his sternum. "Commander Halloran, plot me a course through the shoals, the tightest route, the densest rock, the worst possible terrain for a formation to follow. I want every bottleneck, every choke point, every magnetic dead zone on the route." "Aye, Captain." Halloran turned to the navigation station, already working with Lieutenant Voss, and the 5 ships in the clearing. Stahl looked at the display. The 5 Veth warships were still holding position, their weapons trained on the Resolute. At the Resolute's current readiness, all 5 would be in range of the main guns. One broadside would end them. "Hail them. Channel open. Veth vessels, I am about to maneuver. If you hold your positions and allow me to pass, no shots will be fired. If you attempt to block my movement or fire on my ship, I will respond with full force. You have 30 seconds to decide." The 5 ships held, for 10 seconds, 20. At 24 seconds, the lead destroyer powered down its weapons. One by one, the others followed. The second destroyer, the nervous one with the ragged maneuvering, was last. They pulled back to the edges of the clearing, opening a corridor. "Helm all ahead full. Take the route, Commander," Halloran plotted. "Get us into the rock." The Resolute surged forward, and the chase began in earnest. What followed was 7 hours of the most brutal, grinding, claustrophobic pursuit Asavan had ever witnessed, or ever would. The Resolute plunged into the densest section of the Karatha Shoals, threading through asteroid clusters at speeds that made the hull groan and the structural integrity monitors flash amber warnings that nobody acknowledged. Behind it, the Veth Armada followed, 47 ships funneling into corridors of rock that were never designed for fleet maneuvers. Stahl fought the chase from the command bridge, standing the entire time. She directed the helm with quiet, precise corrections: 2 degrees port. Hold. Now hard starboard, through the gap at bearing 190. Steady. And the Resolute responded like something alive, rolling and pitching through gaps that left less than 100 meters of clearance on either side. The mismatched hull plating scraped mineral dust from passing rocks, and the sound of debris pinging off the shields was a constant, chattering rain that settled into the background of the bridge like weather. Behind them, the Veth paid for every kilometer. The first casualty came 40 minutes into the chase, a destroyer that clipped a tumbling asteroid at speed. Its starboard engine pod sheared away in a spray of alloy fragments, and the ship spun into the rock face with the slow, terrible inevitability of something too heavy to stop. The detonation lit the corridor behind the Resolute in a flash of white that the aft sensors recorded as a brief, violent bloom, and then nothing. No one on the Resolute's bridge commented. Stahl's expression did not change. The second casualty came an hour later, a cruiser that lost its navigational feed in a magnetic anomaly and drifted into a dead-end canyon. Its commander reversed engines, but the frigate following too closely behind had no room to maneuver. The 2 ships locked together with a sound that even vacuum couldn't fully swallow, their hulls grinding, their crews fighting to separate before the canyon walls crushed them both. 2 down, the sensor officer reported. 45 contacts remaining in pursuit. And the gap between them and us, Stahl asked. Widening. The lead elements are 12 minutes behind us. The main body is 30 minutes back. The flagship, the sensor officer checked the display. The flagship has dropped to quarter speed. Its escorts are having difficulty with the terrain. Good, Stahl leaned forward. Helm, take us through the Fenris Gap, the narrow channel at bearing 278. It's barely wide enough for us. Nothing larger than a destroyer can follow. Captain, the Fenris Gap is 4 kilometers long with a 40-degree turn in the middle. At our speed. At our speed it will be unpleasant. Do it. The Fenris Gap was worse than unpleasant. It was a channel carved through solid rock by some ancient gravitational event, barely 300 meters wide at its narrowest point, and the Resolute was 240 meters across the beam. Stahl guided the ship through it with her hands on the helm repeater, calling corrections in a voice that never rose above conversational, and the bridge crew held their breath as the hull plating passed within 20 meters of the rock walls on either side. Mineral dust scraped along the shields in a scream of electromagnetic friction. The lateral sensor arrays folded against the hull to avoid being torn off. When they cleared the far end, 3 Veth destroyers that had been closing from behind pulled up short at the gap's entrance and stopped. They were too wide to follow. The Veth built their destroyers with extended lateral fins for sensor coverage, and those fins would not fit through the channel. 3 more contacts stalled, the sensor officer reported. They're trying to find an alternate route around. There isn't one for 6 hours, Lieutenant Voss said from the navigation station, and there was quiet satisfaction in her voice. Stahl permitted herself nothing. What's the count now? 42 contacts in active pursuit. 3 stalled at the Fenris Gap. 2 destroyed. The remaining Veth ships that entered the shoals are strung out across 18 kilometers of corridor behind us. By the 3rd hour, the Veth formation had disintegrated entirely. Ships that had operated as a single tactical unit in open space were now individual vessels fighting their own separate battles against the terrain, each one navigating by its own sensors, each one losing contact with the ships ahead and behind as magnetic interference swallowed their communications. The disciplined strike group of 47 warships had become a scattered, strung-out column of confused, isolated ships stumbling through an asteroid field behind a target they could barely track. The Resolute moved through the rock like it had been built for exactly this, and in a way, Asavan realized. It had. The old Vanguard-class dreadnoughts were designed for dense field operations where maneuverability mattered more than speed and armor mattered more than numbers. The ship's compact hull, its oversized maneuvering thrusters, its dense ablative plating, the way its mass sat low and centered, all of it made sense in the shoals in a way that it never had in open space. This was the ship's native terrain. Stahl was using the ship the way it was meant to be used. She just didn't seem to take any satisfaction in it. At the 3.5-hour mark, the ship's chief engineer called the bridge. Her name was Patel, and her voice carried the particular calm of someone who had been dealing with emergencies for longer than some of the bridge crew had been alive. Captain, the port maneuvering thruster assembly is running 12 degrees above nominal. The mineral dust in the shoals is fouling the intake vanes. I can keep it operational, but if you need a hard lateral correction at speed, I'd like about 4 seconds of warning. Noted, Chief. I'll try to give you 5. Appreciated, ma'am. Patel out. Halloran glanced at Stahl. If that thruster goes, we lose lateral maneuverability on the port side. Every gap we thread from here on out needs to account for that. I know. Voss, adjust the remaining routes, favor right-hand clearances where possible. If we need to dodge, we dodge starboard. Adjusting, Captain. It was a small thing, a thruster running hot. A course preference shifted, but it was the kind of small thing that, in the shoals, could kill a ship. Asavan watched Stahl absorb it the way she absorbed everything, without reaction, without complaint, with a single adjustment to the plan, and a quiet acknowledgement that the universe had just narrowed her options by 1 degree. She had been doing this for 14 hours. Each hour had narrowed her options a little more, and she had responded to each narrowing with the same flat, measuring calm. He wondered what the inside of that calm looked like. He suspected it looked nothing like the outside. At the 4-hour mark, she ordered the Resolute into a dense cluster and cut engines. The ship drifted in the sensor shadow of a nickel iron asteroid the size of a city block, and for 20 minutes nothing moved. The bridge crew sat in red-amber silence, listening to the distant pinging of the hull cooling and the low hum of the reactors idling. Veth contacts are spreading, the sensor officer reported. They've lost our track. 15 ships have cleared the dense zone and are fanning out in the open pocket beyond. The rest are still strung through the corridors. 7 have dropped to minimal power, possibly damaged from terrain impacts. The 15 in the open pocket, Stahl said. What's their composition? 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 3 frigates, no flagship. The flagship. Still in the main column, deep in the shoals. Moving slowly, its escorts are struggling. Stahl studied the display. The 15 Veth ships in the open pocket were searching, spreading out, pinging with active sensors, trying to flush the Resolute from whatever hole it had crawled into. The remaining ships were scattered through the asteroid corridors behind them, and the flagship was buried somewhere in the middle of the formation, blind and slow, and surrounded by rock. Commander, Stahl said, if I take us out of this cluster at full power and hit those 15 ships in the pocket, what happens? Halloran ran the numbers. He didn't need long. At full combat speed, we'd be among them in 6 minutes. The pocket is confined enough that they can't scatter effectively, 3 exits, all narrow. Our railguns would have firing solutions on every ship in the pocket within 90 seconds of engagement. And the other ships? Minimum 20 minutes before the nearest could reach the pocket through the corridors. Most would take over an hour. The flagship, maybe 2 hours. Stahl was quiet for a long time. The bridge waited. The asteroid outside the viewport tumbled in its slow, indifferent orbit, and its shadow passed across the hull like a hand shading eyes from the sun. 15 ships, she said. Roughly 3,000 crew per cruiser, 800 per destroyer, 200 per frigate. That's 18,800 sentient beings in that pocket. Sailors, officers, engineers, cooks. Probably a few who signed up because they believed in the Pelivar talks and got sent here anyway. Approximately, Halloran said. His voice was neutral, but his hands were not. They rested on the edge of his console, and the tendons stood out. And if I don't hit them, if I bypass the pocket and run for open space, the entire formation consolidates behind us, and we're back to 42 ships in a straight chase with no terrain to work with. That's the math, Captain. Stahl pressed her palms flat against the edge of the tactical display. Asivan watched her fingers. They were steady, perfectly controlled, and white at the knuckles. Open a channel to the pocket. Wide broadcast all frequencies. Channel open. Veth vessels in the Karatha clearing. This is Captain Stahl of the Terran dreadnought Resolute. I am offering you one opportunity to withdraw. Reverse course through the corridors you entered by and clear the pocket. You have 15 minutes. I will not make this offer again. The comm crackled. A Veth voice, not the same one from the standoff, younger, sharper, carrying the harmonic edge of a commander trying to sound certain, answered. Terran vessel, you are in no position to issue demands. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Surrender your ship immediately or be destroyed. You are not surrounding me, Stahl said, and her voice carried something new, not anger, not threat, but the flat, exhausted patience of a woman explaining something for the last time. You are 15 ships in a pocket with 3 narrow exits, and I am faster than all of them. Your fleet is scattered through 40 kilometers of asteroid field behind you. Your flagship cannot reach you for at least 2 hours. Your communications with the main body are compromised by magnetic interference, and you have 7 ships behind you that are damaged and drifting. You are not a net. You are the fish, and you haven't realized it yet. Silence. 15 minutes, Stahl said. I would strongly prefer not to use them. She cut the comm and turned to Halloran. Marcus, if they don't withdraw, I need those railguns. They've been ready for 4 hours, Captain. I know they have, she paused. I also know that every one of those ships has a crew that's been chasing us through rock for 4 hours because someone on a flagship they can't even reach told them to. They're not the ones who decided to start this. They're just the ones who got pushed to the front. With respect, ma'am, they're also the ones with their weapons pointed at us. Yes, they are. The 15 minutes passed. Asivan counted them the way he'd counted the 41 minutes of the standoff. Each one a small, precise unit of time in which Mercy waited for an answer. At minute 7, 2 of the frigates broke formation and began reversing course toward the corridors. They powered down their weapons as they moved. At minute 9, 3 destroyers followed, peeling away one at a time, their running lights shifting to non-combat mode. At minute 12, 2 more destroyers withdrew. The pocket was thinning. At minute 13, the 4 cruisers held position. Their weapons remained hot, their shields at full combat power. The remaining 3 destroyers and 1 frigate held with them, 8 ships total, their guns trained on the empty space where the Resolute was hiding. At minute 15, the young Veth voice returned. We will not withdraw. Your bluff is noted, Terran. Stahl closed her eyes. It was the first time Asivan had seen her do that, the first crack in the flat, featureless control she had maintained for 14 hours straight. Her hands were still flat on the display edge, still perfectly steady, still white at the knuckles. When she opened her eyes, they were the same tarnished steel, but something behind them had settled into place, like a lock engaging. Helm all ahead full, take us into the pocket. Weapons officer, target the cruisers first. Main guns only. Precision fire, I want engine sections and weapons arrays. No hull breaches below the waterline. Disable, not destroy. Confirm. Confirmed, Captain. Engine sections and weapons arrays. Precision fire. Captain Halloran started. I said precision fire, Commander. We're disabling them, not killing them. If any of those crews want to live through this, I am going to make that possible. But I need their guns off the table before the rest of the fleet finds its way here. The Resolute came out of its hiding place like a fist through glass. It accelerated from a dead drift to full combat speed in under 40 seconds, the old reactors hammering to full power with a sound like a mountain waking up, and the 8 remaining Veth ships in the pocket had perhaps 15 seconds of warning. A sensor flash, a thermal bloom, the impossible sight of a Terran dreadnought materializing from behind an asteroid at a speed that nothing that heavy should achieve. The Resolute's railguns did not fire like energy weapons. There was no beam, no flash of coherent light. There was a sound, a deep, chest-compressing thud that Asavan felt in his ribcage and the back of his skull, and then, 3 seconds later, a Veth cruiser's engine section detonated. Not the whole ship, the engine section. The round had threaded through the cruiser's shield envelope at the exhaust port gap, the geometric weakness that every warship in every fleet left exposed, because you couldn't shield the space your engines needed to vent through. And it had punched through the engine housing with the precision of a scalpel, shredding the power coupling without breaching the main hull. The cruiser went dark, dead in space but intact, her crew alive. The second cruiser lost its weapons, array 7 seconds later. The railgun round hit the dorsal turret ring and carved through it lengthwise, peeling the gun housings open like something splitting a seed pod. The cruiser's point defense systems went wild for a moment, firing at empty space, then shut down as the fire control system recognized the catastrophic damage and disconnected. The third cruiser tried to run. It wheeled toward the nearest exit, engines flaring, but the Resolute was already between it and the gap. A single railgun round took its port maneuvering thruster, and the ship lurched sideways, spinning, its helmsman fighting to compensate with the remaining thrusters. The fourth cruiser fired. Its main battery discharged, a concentrated lance of plasma that crossed the pocket in less than a second and hit the Resolute's forward shield in a wash of orange and white and heat. The Resolute shuddered. Damage alarms sounded on 3 decks. A conduit burst somewhere behind the bridge, and the smell of scorched insulation filled the air. Stahl didn't flinch. Return fire, engines only. The railgun round hit the fourth cruiser amidships, exactly where the main power conduit ran between the reactor and the engine assembly. The ship convulsed, interior lights flickering, artificial gravity failing for 3 seconds that must have felt like 30, and then went still. Emergency beacons activated along its hull, pulsing in the amber rhythm that every spacefaring species in 3 sectors recognized as surrender. 14 seconds, 4 cruisers disabled, 4 crews alive, none destroyed. The remaining destroyers and the frigate broke. They scattered toward the corridors, weapons powering down, and the Resolute let them go, every one of them. Secure from firing, Stahl said. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been 14 hours ago. Helm, take us through the northern corridor. Best speed to open space. Aye, Captain. Northern corridor, best speed. The Resolute moved, past the 4 drifting cruisers. Asavan watched them on the display, dark hulks bleeding atmosphere from precision wounds, their crews alive, their escape pods cycling, their emergency beacons screaming for help that was still 40 minutes through the rock. Stahl watched them too. She watched them until they fell off the edge of the sensor wall, and then she watched the space where they had been. Commander Halloran, transmit our navigational data on the safe routes through the shoals to the Veth flagship's last known position. Full dataset, every route we mapped, every magnetic anomaly, every hazard we flagged. Include the locations of the 4 disabled ships and the 2 vessels that collided earlier. Halloran stared at her. You want to send them a map? I want to make sure their rescue teams can reach the disabled ships before their life support fails. Those corridors are a labyrinth. Without our data, it could take them hours to find the right route, and those cruisers don't have hours. Their reactor cooling is offline with the engines gone. Captain, they just tried to kill us. No, their political command tried to provoke us into starting a war. Those 4 cruisers held the line because their flag told them to hold it, and that is what sailors do. They're not my enemies, Commander. They're instruments of someone else's ambition. She paused. Send the data, all of it. Halloran sent the data. The Resolute cleared the Karatha shoals at 9:17 ship time, 19 hours after the first contact. It emerged into open space with its weapons still hot, its shields at combat power, and 23 fresh impact scars along its hull from asteroid debris. Behind it, the Veth Armada was still buried in the rock, scattered, disorganized, 2 ships destroyed by their own navigation errors, 4 more disabled by precision fire, 7 damaged from terrain impacts, and the rest struggling to reform in an environment that punished every attempt at coordination. 47 ships had entered the shoals to catch 1 dreadnought. 13 were out of the fight, and the dreadnought was in open space with a clear run to neutral port. Stahl stood on the bridge and watched the shoals recede on the aft display. The asteroids tumbled in their ancient, indifferent orbits, and somewhere among them, 18,000 Veth sailors aboard 4 disabled cruisers were alive, because she had aimed for engines instead of hulls. "Com, get me a secure channel to Terran Command." "Secure channel established, Captain. Signal is clean, we're clear of the interference." "Command, this is Captain Stahl, TDN Resolute. We have exited the Karatha shoals after 19 hours of contact with a Veth Dominion strike group of 47 vessels. The Veth attempted to enforce an unauthorized blockade of the neutral corridor under a unilateral suspension of the Pelivar Accords, and pursued the Resolute into the shoals when we declined to submit to boarding. Engagement occurred in the shoals. 4 Veth heavy cruisers disabled, engine sections and weapons arrays only, no hulls breached, no estimated casualties. 2 additional Veth vessels destroyed by navigational error, their own. 7 Veth vessels damaged by terrain, 0 Terran casualties. The Veth formation is currently scattered and disorganized within the shoals. I am proceeding to neutral port with diplomatic liaison 3rd rank Asavan aboard. She paused. "Command, be advised. The Veth Dominion's military faction, the Akathan Bloc, is actively seeking a provocation to justify war. The blockade was designed to force us to fire first. I did not accommodate them. The 4 disabled cruisers were fired upon only after they refused a direct offer to withdraw, and after one of them fired on the Resolute. Full engagement data, including the Resolute's weapons-cold posture during the initial standoff and the withdrawal offer, is attached." Another pause, longer. "I wanted on the record that I offered them a way out, and 5 of their ships took it. The other 8 chose to stay. I wanted on the record that when I fired, every round was aimed to disable, not destroy. And I wanted on the record that I transmitted our full navigational dataset to the Veth flagship, so their rescue teams could reach the disabled ships before their life support failed. If the Akathan Bloc wants to turn this into a casus belli, they'll have to explain to their own moderates why 47 warships couldn't stop 1 dreadnought that spent 19 hours trying not to kill anyone." "Stall out." She cut the channel. The bridge was silent. Asavan looked at the aft display. The shoals were a dark smear against the starfield now, shrinking as the Resolute accelerated toward open space and the safety of neutral jurisdiction. Somewhere in that smear, Veth rescue teams were already moving, following the navigational routes that Stahl had given them, threading through rock and interference to reach 4 cruisers that were dark and drifting and alive. He thought about what he would write in his report, the diplomatic language for what had happened here. The careful, measured phrases that would describe how a single Terran dreadnought had outmaneuvered 47 Veth warships, disabled 4 without killing anyone, led 2 more to destroy themselves against the terrain, and then handed the enemy the map to save their own people, and how the captain had done all of it with the look of someone carrying a weight she would never set down and never explain. He thought about the Veth Dominion Council, The moderates who had spent months crafting the Pelavar Accords, the Akathan hardliners who had sabotaged them. He thought about what Stahl's navigational data would mean in that council chamber. It was not a military document. It was a political one. Proof that the Terran captain who had disabled 4 Veth cruisers had then transmitted the rescue routes, voluntarily, with no obligation and no demand for reciprocity. Proof that the provoked party had been more concerned with saving Veth lives than with winning a tactical argument. The Akathan bloc could spin the engagement however they liked, but they could not spin the navigational data. It was too clean, too specific, too clearly an act of someone who did not want the people she had defeated to die. The moderates would use it. Asivan was certain of that. They would read it into the record. They would distribute it to the Veth press services. They would hold it up as evidence that Earth was not the aggressor the Akathan bloc claimed, and that the provocation had been manufactured from the start. Whether it would be enough, whether anything could be enough to stop a faction that wanted war badly enough to sacrifice 47 ships to get it, he didn't know. But it was the best weapon a diplomat could ask for, and it had been given to him by a woman who insisted she hadn't thought about politics. "Captain Stahl," he said. She turned. The tarnished steel eyes rested on him, and behind them the tiredness was back, the heavy, settled weight that had been there before the battle station's alarm, before the railguns, before the chase through the rock. The weight of a woman who could put a railgun round through an engine housing at combat speed without touching the hull on the other side, and who wished that talent had never been necessary. "Your report will describe this as a tactical success, I assume." Stahl considered the question the way she considered everything, carefully, with the measuring patience of someone who knew that words, like rounds, went where you aimed them. "My report will describe what happened. Terran Command can call it whatever they want. The Veth will call it an act of war. Probably. The Akathan bloc will use it. They'll point to the 4 disabled cruisers and call it aggression. The moderates will point to the navigational data and the precision fire and the withdrawal offer and argue that it proves we weren't looking for a fight. It'll come down to which side has more votes in the Dominion Council." She paused. "That's your area, liaison, not mine." Asivan nodded slowly. "For what it is worth, Captain, in my professional assessment, the navigational data was the most important shot you fired today. It will be harder for the war faction to argue provocation when the provoked party sent rescue coordinates to save the lives of the ships that attacked her. I didn't send it for political reasons. I know that's why it will work." Stahl looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the forward display, where open space stretched ahead, empty and dark, and indifferent to the question of whether what had happened in the rock behind them would lead to peace or to war. "Helm, maintain course for neutral port. Standard cruise speed." "Aye, Captain, standard cruise." The Resolute settled into its steady, thrumming rhythm, the old reactors humming their low octave, the heat vanes cycling along the dorsal spine, the mismatched hull plating catching starlight along its battle-scarred surface. It moved through open space with the slow, deliberate certainty of something that had been built to endure, and had spent 19 hours proving it. Asivan returned to his observer station and began composing his report. He wrote for 3 hours, choosing each word with the care of a man who understood that what had happened in the Karatha Shoals would be read by councils and commanders and historians on both sides for years to come, and that the difference between war and peace might rest on whether he found exactly the right framing. He chose his words the way Stahl aimed her railguns, precisely, with an awareness that placement mattered more than force. A word too aggressive, and the Akathan bloc would quote it out of context to support their narrative of Terran aggression. A word too soft, and the moderates would lack the ammunition they needed to defend the peace process. He had to be exactly right, and he had to be so clearly right that no one on either side could argue with the facts he presented without looking dishonest to their own constituents. He titled it, Incident Report Karatha Corridor, Pelavar Neutral Zone, and he began with the one detail that he knew mattered more than any other. The Resolute fired 6 rounds, 4 struck engine sections, 1 struck a weapons array, 1 struck a maneuvering thruster. Every round landed exactly where the captain intended. None of them were aimed to kill. He paused, then added the line that would be quoted in every council session and every analysis and every briefing for the next decade. 47 ships could not make her fire the 7th. On the bridge, Captain Maren Stahl remained at her station. She would stay there for another 4 hours, long after the shoals had vanished from the sensors, long after the last Veth contact faded from the display, long after the danger had passed, and the only thing remaining was the quiet, exhausted certainty that she had made the right choices for reasons that no report would ever fully capture. She had aimed for engines because the crews inside those ships were sailors, and sailors followed orders, and the orders they followed were not their own fault. She had sent the navigational data because 18,000 people in disabled ships had nothing to do with the politics that had put them in her path. She had offered 15 minutes because she needed to know, not for the record, not for command, but for herself, that she had given them every chance to walk away. 5 of them had taken it, 8 had not. She had fired on the 8 as precisely as she knew how, and every one of them was alive because she could do what very few captains in any fleet in any species had ever been able to do: put a railgun round through an engine housing at full combat speed without touching the hull behind it. It was not mercy. Mercy implied she had the luxury of choosing softness. It was duty, the kind that lived in the narrow space between the person you wanted to be and the things the universe required you to do, and made you carry both without setting either one down. The Resolute moved through open space, alone, its hull scarred and its crew quiet and its captain standing watch over nothing but the dark ahead. 47 ships had tried to make her start a war. She had given them a map home instead.